Outside, the wind hums through bare November branches. The last of the autumn leaves rattle across the frozen ground, and somewhere in the dark distance, a train whistle echoes through the cold. Inside, though, the light is warm. A single lamp, a crackling fire, and the soft glow of a window pane kissed by frost. It's the kind of night made for stories. So, settle in, pull the blanket a little closer, pour a cup of something warm, and let's step back in time to a Thanksgiving long ago. Tonight on Holiday History, we'll travel to the year 1950, when a storm so powerful, so unforgettable, swept across America that it would be remembered for generations as the Great Thanksgiving Blizzard. It was a storm that buried towns, silenced highways, and turned bustling cities into snow-covered stillness. Yet amid all that cold and chaos, there were families gathered close around candlelight, giving thanks in the most unexpected of ways. Before we begin our story, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Maybe you can hear the wind outside your own window, or the hum of a heater that's keeping the chill at bay. Wherever you are tonight, I invite you to imagine what it was like 75 years ago, when Thanksgiving morning dawned not with sunshine and parades, but with a sky heavy with snow. The year was 1950. The war was over, and America was changing fast. Families were moving into new houses. Children were watching television for the very first time, and Thanksgiving had become a symbol of peace. A chance to gather, to rest, and to be grateful for the promise of ordinary days. But that November, nature had its own plans. It began quietly, like most great stories do. A few flurries in the Midwest, a chill on the air that felt sharper than usual. Forecasts hinted at snow, but few paid much attention. After all, snow on Thanksgiving wasn't so unusual. Not yet. Not until that soft dusting turned into a wall of white that would sweep across the heart of the nation, freezing rivers, burying roads, and changing the course of that holiday forever. This is the story of that storm, of families stranded in their homes, of travellers huddled in train stations, of neighbours sharing warmth and food when supplies ran low. It's a story of frozen turkey dinners cooked by lantern light, of sleighs replacing cars, and of communities rediscovering what Thanksgiving truly meant. In this episode, we'll explore how it all began, from the calm before the storm to the blizzard that became legend. We'll learn about the meteorologists who tried to warn the country, the farmers who watched helplessly as their fields disappeared beneath the snow, and the ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when the world around them turned white. And by the end, perhaps we'll see why the Great Thanksgiving Blizzard of 1950 became more than just a weather event. It became a story of endurance, kindness, and gratitude in the face of nature's power. So, as the wind howls outside and the snow begins to fall in our imagination, let's begin. You're listening to Holiday History. If you enjoy these bedtime stories from the past, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. And as always, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment below and share a bit of your world with ours. Now, let's travel back to that frozen Thanksgiving of 1950. A time when the snow came early, the wind blew hard, and America learned just how warm a home can feel. when the world outside is buried in white. The year 1950 was one of calm after a long, uneasy decade. The echoes of World War II had faded, and the United States stood on the threshold of a new era, an age of prosperity, invention, and confidence. Veterans had returned home to start families, and neighborhoods across the nation buzzed with the hopeful rhythm of hammers and saws. Rows of tidy houses were rising on the edges of cities, white picket fences and kitchen gardens sprouting where old farmlands had stood. Across the country, a generation that had known rations and loss was learning to savour abundance again. That November, the newspapers were full of holiday recipes and family photographs. Butter was no longer rationed, sugar was plentiful, and pumpkin pies, rich, spiced, and proudly homemade, once again graced every table. Thanksgiving was not just a meal, it was a symbol of peace restored, of normalcy finally returning to the American household. In 1950, America was still a country of neighborhoods and small towns. The rhythm of daily life moved at a gentler pace. Milk bottles on porches, handwritten letters arriving in the afternoon, and the hum of a radio in nearly every kitchen. Television, a new marvel of the post-war age, was just beginning to flicker in living rooms, gathering families around glowing screens to watch variety shows, baseball, and the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, which that year would be broadcast live to a national audience for the very first time. On those black and white screens, cartoon balloons floated between Manhattan skyscrapers, marching bands gleamed beneath chilly grey skies, and announcers spoke of a fine day for giving thanks. Radios still hummed in kitchens, though, their warm tubes glowing like little hearths, broadcasting Bing Crosby and Perry Como crooning Christmas tunes a week too soon. The smell of coffee and cinnamon filled the air, and children traced turkeys on construction paper at school, writing lists of what they were thankful for in careful cursive. For many, it was the first Thanksgiving in years that felt truly normal. Fathers came home from factory shifts, mothers prepared feasts with pride, and grandparents sat near the fire, telling stories of how they'd celebrated back before the war. In towns from Kansas to Pennsylvania, the same ritual unfolded. Church services in the morning, turkey in the afternoon, and football humming on the radio as evening fell. In Cleveland, families look forward to the city's annual holiday parade. In Pittsburgh, trains brought home college students and soldiers stationed nearby. In Chicago, department store windows glittered with animated snowmen and mechanical reindeer, drawing crowds who pressed their gloved hands to the glass. Thanksgiving meant not only food, but togetherness, the chance to stop, to breathe, and to feel grateful for the humdrum blessings of daily life. And yet, if you'd stepped outside that week, you might have felt it. The bite in the air sharper than it should have been. The kind of cold that hinted at something stirring far to the north. Weather forecasts spoke of a cold snap drifting down from Canada. Nothing unusual for late November, or so it seemed. People noted the chill, pulled their coats tighter, and went back to basting turkeys. Still, the signs were there. Across the Great Lakes, fishermen noticed the water turning restless, dark, steel grey, and capped with white foam. The air above the lakes carried the smell of iron and ice. Farmers in Ohio spoke of geese flying lower than usual, their V formations trembling against a pale sky. In rural West Virginia, smoke from chimneys rose straight upward, unfurling slowly before vanishing, a sure sign that the air was heavy and still. But inside America's kitchens, no one was thinking of weather patterns or jet streams. Housewives in floral aprons mixed cranberry sauce and mashed potatoes. Children licked frosting from beaters, and fathers tuned the radio dial, waiting to hear who would play in the Thanksgiving weekend football games. The country was alive with the gentle hum of holiday preparation. On the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, streets filled with cars. Gas was cheap, and travel was becoming part of the tradition. Sons and daughters driving home from the city, the trunk loaded with gifts and casseroles. Greyhound buses were crowded with servicemen heading to see family, their wool coats dusted with road grit. Railways, too, were packed, the long silver cars cutting through frosty valleys toward destinations scattered across the Midwest and Northeast. In towns along those tracks, station agents wore heavy wool coats and tipped their hats as trains arrived, the air around them filled with the hiss of steam and the scent of coal smoke. Children waved at passengers through the windows, their mittened hands pressed to the glass. The rhythm of wheels on rails echoed through the night like the heartbeat of the holiday itself. Farther south, in Kentucky and Tennessee, people spoke of how the weather had turned strange. 1 hour calm, the next cuttingly cold. A farmhand outside Lexington recalled later that the sky looked like tin, dull and heavy, and the crows went quiet. Still, no one thought much of it. The holiday spirit was stronger than any forecast. As dusk fell on Thanksgiving Eve, a quiet settled across the land. In neighborhoods from Detroit to Cincinnati, windows glowed amber in the dark. The smell of roasting turkey drifted through alleys and snowless yards. On the radio, President Harry Truman's Thanksgiving proclamation reminded Americans to give thanks for peace and freedom. Words that echoed softly through kitchens and parlors, as if blessing the evening itself. Few could imagine how, within hours, that same peace would be tested by the forces of nature. Up north, over the cold plains of Canada, a mass of frigid Arctic air was sliding southward, silent and immense. To the west, over the Mississippi Valley, a warm, moisture-laden front from the Gulf of Mexico was pushing north. When the two met, the atmosphere would tremble. Meteorologists, still working with pencils, barometers, and limited radar, began to notice falling pressures and shifting winds. They scribbled notes on charts, sent telegrams, and warned of snow. But in a nation eager for family and feasting, few were listening. For now, the night was calm. Snowflakes began to appear in Minnesota, just a few, soft and harmless. In Ohio, the sky deepened to a strange bruised shade of blue-grey as the sun went down. The air felt heavy, as though the world were holding its breath. In one small town in Pennsylvania, a family of 6 gathered around their table to say grace. The father's hands were rough from work, the mother's eyes tired but content. Outside their window, the first delicate flakes began to drift down, unnoticed at first, like tiny whispers from the heavens. Thanksgiving morning would dawn soon, and when it did, the world they knew would be transformed. But on that evening, November 23rd, 1950, America slept peacefully. The radios played soft music, The streets were still, and a nation at peace gave quiet thanks beneath a sky that was already changing. Thanksgiving morning, November 23rd, 1950, began in silence. Across much of the Midwest, the dawn arrived behind a pale grey veil. The sun, if it was there at all, was little more than a dim circle hidden behind thickening clouds. In Cleveland, the air was strangely still. No breeze, no birdsong. Streets that only yesterday had been filled with the bustle of travellers now lay quiet beneath a faint, icy mist. By mid-morning, the first snowflakes began to fall, small and tentative, melting as they touched the ground. To most, it was a welcome sight. Snow on Thanksgiving felt poetic, like a blessing from the season itself. Children pressed their faces to frosted windows, watching the flakes drift lazily through the air. Mothers smiled, wrapping scarves around their little ones before they ran out to catch them on their tongues. No one could yet imagine that those delicate flakes were only the beginning of one of the most extraordinary blizzards in American history. Far above those quiet neighborhoods, the sky was in turmoil. A vast current of Arctic air had surged southward from Canada overnight, driven by powerful winds circling the polar jet stream. It was bitterly cold, air that had been born in the far north, over the frozen tundra of the Yukon, and carried with it temperatures rarely seen so early in the season. Meanwhile, from the Gulf of Mexico, a warm, moisture-laden front was sweeping north, its humid breath rising over the Mississippi Valley. Where they met, over the heartland of the United States, the atmosphere buckled and boiled. Meteorologists later described it as one of the sharpest temperature contrasts ever recorded in November. A line across the country where the mercury could drop 30 degrees in a matter of hours. In St. Louis, the day began chilly but dry. By evening, snow was swirling down so thick that street lamps glowed in halos of white. In Columbus, Ohio, residents recalled a sky that seemed to change colour by the minute. From pewter to violet, then to a deep, storm-dark blue. The pressure dropped rapidly, and winds began to rise. Weather forecasting in 1950 was a far cry from the satellite-guided science we know today. There were no radar maps on screens, no digital models predicting the storm's path. Forecasts were handwritten, sent by telegraph between regional offices, and interpreted by meteorologists hunched over paper charts. Many warned of a significant snowstorm developing in the Midwest and Appalachians, but few grasped the magnitude. By midday on Thanksgiving, snow was falling across Ohio, Michigan, and western Pennsylvania. In some places, it was light and feathery. In others, heavy and wet. In the small town of Steubenville, Ohio, a local paper described snowflakes as big as feathers, tumbling through the air in complete silence. By nightfall, the silence was replaced by the low moan of wind. Farther east over the Appalachians, the storm intensified as the two air masses collided. Cold air from the north forced the warm Gulf moisture upward, creating massive, moisture-heavy clouds. What had begun as a modest snow turned into an all-out blizzard. Gusts reached 50 miles per hour in the valleys, and over 70 in the high ridges. In West Virginia, travellers on mountain roads found themselves blinded by swirling white, their cars stalling as snow packed the grills and mufflers. In Pittsburgh, Thanksgiving dinners were interrupted by the flicker of lights and the rumble of wind outside. Power lines, heavy with ice, began to sag. One by one, neighborhoods went dark, families finishing their meals by candlelight. In some homes, the heat went out entirely, and people gathered near fireplaces, piling on blankets and laughing nervously, unaware that they were at the center of what would soon be called the Great Appalachian Storm. By Thanksgiving night, the storm had stretched across hundreds of miles. In Kentucky, freezing rain coated trees in glassy armor. In Michigan, snowdrifts were already knee-deep, and Lake Erie's waves froze mid-crest along the shore. Railroad lines slowed to a crawl as snow buried the tracks. Engineers leaned out of locomotive windows, squinting through blinding flurries, their breath freezing in the air. And the temperature kept falling. In the Midwest, readings plunged to record lows, single digits in some areas, below zero in others. The air was so dry and bitter that it burned the skin. In Cincinnati, the thermometer hit 5 degrees Fahrenheit. In Columbus, it fell to 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the mountains of West Virginia, where the winds screamed through the hollows, it dropped below zero and kept going. But perhaps the most astonishing change was yet to come. Behind the blizzard's leading edge, a second front developed, a cyclone of frigid air spinning counterclockwise, pulling the storm tighter and deeper. Meteorologists in Washington, D.C., watching their barometers plummet, realized they were witnessing something historic. One of the lowest pressure systems ever recorded east of the Rockies. The storm was no longer a simple cold front. It had become a monster. By Friday morning, November 24th, Thanksgiving travelers who had set out the day before found themselves stranded across the country. Highways were blocked by snowdrifts taller than cars. Buses stalled on rural roads, their passengers bundled together for warmth. Air travel ground to a halt as visibility dropped to zero and airports closed one after another. And yet, amid all that chaos, life went on in its own quiet, determined way. In small farmhouses, families rose early to stoke their stoves, breaking the crust of ice that had formed overnight on their water buckets. Children woke to a world transformed, peering out at fences buried in snow and barns half disappearing into drifts. In the cities, streetcars inched along frozen rails, and pedestrians clutched one another's arms to keep from slipping. By afternoon, the great Thanksgiving blizzard had spread from the Great Lakes all the way to the eastern seaboard. In New York and New Jersey, strong winds tore down power lines, while inland towns braced for even heavier snow. The country was being blanketed under a single sweeping storm, a Thanksgiving none would forget. Back in the Midwest, the heart of the storm pulsed strongest. In eastern Ohio and western Pennsylvania, snow piled higher by the hour. Reporters described scenes of white mountains forming in the streets, and cars swallowed entirely. Entire communities were cut off, telephones silenced, and all travel halted. At one small weather station in Pittsburgh, the barometer continued to fall until the needle nearly touched the bottom of the gauge. The meteorologist on duty later recalled stepping outside to empty his snow gauge and finding the air so dense and cold that his breath froze instantly. The sound, he said, was gone. The wind made a low roar, but beneath it, nothing, just the stillness of snow. By evening, the great Thanksgiving blizzard had truly taken hold. It was a storm of contradictions, brutal yet beautiful, terrifying yet strangely peaceful. The country that had gathered to give thanks now found itself humbled before the power of the natural world. Families drew closer to one another, sharing candles, warmth, and stories. And though the storm would rage for days, it would also reveal something extraordinary about the people who lived through it. Their quiet courage, their generosity, and their ability to find gratitude even as the snow kept falling. For now, though, the blizzard was only beginning, and America was about to learn what it meant to give thanks, when the whole world was buried in white. Thanksgiving night faded into Friday morning beneath a sky of swirling white. By dawn, most of the Midwest was buried. What had started as a picturesque snowfall on Thursday had turned, overnight, into an unrelenting wall of winter. The storm deepened through the night like a living thing, breathing ice and wind into every corner of the land. In Ohio, the city of Cleveland awoke to a world transformed. Streets that had bustled with travelers just 2 days before now lay silent under more than a foot of snow, and it was still falling. The air had turned to a thick haze of white, so dense that lampposts disappeared just a few feet away. Car engines froze solid, and even the sound of snowplows became muffled, lost in the roar of the wind. Radio announcers urged citizens to stay indoors. The city was officially paralyzed. Trains sat motionless on their tracks, their wheels locked in ice. Streetcars were abandoned mid-route, their windows rimmed with frost. Even the city's great steel mills slowed to a crawl as workers struggled simply to reach the gates. Across the Great Lakes, the storm grew worse. Blinding snow and fierce winds battered northern Ohio, western Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Gusts off Lake Erie whipped through downtown Cleveland at over 40 miles per hour, forming drifts so high they swallowed cars whole. In some neighborhoods, people tunneled out of their front doors like moles, emerging into waist-deep snow that shimmered in the weak grey daylight. And still, it snowed. In Pennsylvania, the city of Pittsburgh recorded its heaviest snowfall in history, more than 30 inches in just a few days. The weight of it collapsed roofs and snapped telephone lines. Buses were stranded mid-intersection, their passengers helping one another dig out just enough to find shelter in nearby homes. Across the hills of western Pennsylvania, entire towns disappeared beneath the drifts, connected only by the distant echo of church bells ringing through the storm. On the open plains, the wind howled with a strange, mournful pitch. Farmers peered from their barns, their livestock huddled together for warmth. Horses and cattle stood in the snow like statues, their breath rising in great white clouds. Fences vanished beneath the drifts. Only the tops of posts peeked out, marking where property lines used to be. Trains were among the hardest hit. The Pennsylvania Railroad reported locomotives frozen in place, their massive engines encased in ice. Crews worked tirelessly with torches and shovels to free the steel wheels from the tracks. In some places, stranded passengers slept in their seats, wrapped in coats and blankets, while porters passed out coffee brewed on small camp stoves. For travellers trying to reach loved ones for the holiday, it was a nightmare. Buses broke down on desolate highways. Families in Plymouth and Akron abandoned their cars entirely, walking toward the nearest light in the distance. Some took refuge in churches, schools, and roadside diners. And in every shelter, the same scene repeated. Strangers becoming neighbors, sharing what food they had, telling stories by lantern light as the snow piled higher outside. Meanwhile, in the Appalachian Mountains, the blizzard took on an even more ferocious character. West Virginia, already blanketed in snow from the first wave, now faced howling winds that turned valleys into frozen seas. Roads vanished overnight, and mountain passes became impassable. Small towns like Morgantown, Clarksburg, and Wheeling were cut off for days. The National Guard was called in to assist with rescue efforts, using jeeps and snowmobiles to reach stranded families in rural hollows. In the city of Charleston, the Kanawha River froze over for the first time in memory. Residents woke to see the surface glistening with ice, a still silver mirror that reflected the pale morning light. Power lines sagged and snapped under the weight of ice. Some houses lost heat entirely, forcing families to burn anything they could find. Old newspapers, broken furniture, just to keep warm. And yet, even amid the hardship, there was beauty. Those who remember the Great Thanksgiving blizzard often speak of the silence, how the world seemed to pause. The snow muffled everything. Car horns, factory whistles, even the barking of dogs disappeared. Towns once filled with the hum of traffic were hushed, transformed into glittering ghostly landscapes. Nights glowed with an eerie light, the sky reflecting off the endless white below. Children, ever the optimists of any storm, rejoiced. They built forts and tunnels, sliding down drifts taller than their fathers. For them, it was a wonderland, the world remade overnight into something magical. In many towns, parents joined in the laughter, grateful for something to lift the gloom. Snowmen appeared outside shuttered stores, scarves fluttering in the wind, sentinels of joy in a frozen world. But for the adults, the challenges kept mounting. By Friday evening, nearly every major highway in the affected region was closed. In Ohio, some towns ran out of coal and heating oil. Grocery stores couldn't receive deliveries, and fresh milk disappeared from shelves. Telephone service failed in parts of Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Even the mighty U.S. Postal Service was forced to halt operations, a rarity in those days. The storm also brought record-breaking cold. On November 24th, temperatures plummeted across the Midwest and East. In Pittsburgh, the mercury hit 2 degrees Fahrenheit. In Cincinnati, it fell below zero. Winds whipped through city streets, driving the chill deeper. Windows iced over from the inside. People sealed doorways with blankets and old quilts, trying to keep the warmth in. In many homes, neighbors gathered together, pooling candles, firewood, and food. Thanksgiving leftovers became feasts of survival. In a farmhouse near Zanesville, Ohio, one family of 12 huddled by the kitchen stove, rationing their turkey and potatoes for 3 days until the roads cleared. In Pennsylvania, a young couple stuck in their car for nearly 20 hours survived on pumpkin pie and thermos coffee, later laughing about it when they told reporters, "We've never been so thankful for dessert." In West Virginia, the storm took a more tragic turn. Avalanches of snow along mountain roads stranded hundreds. Some families burned furniture to stay warm. In one coal town, miners used dynamite to clear the entrance of a snow-blocked tunnel so emergency vehicles could pass through. The bravery of ordinary citizens, farmers, miners, bus drivers, and homemakers, turned the disaster into a testament of human endurance. The Great Thanksgiving Blizzard was more than just a storm. It was a wall of contradictions. In the same moment that it froze rivers and silenced cities, it also knit communities together. Families who had never met shared meals. Townspeople dug one another out, house by house. Church bells rang across valleys to signal that help was on the way. Newspapers printed emergency bulletins, reminding readers to check on the elderly and to melt snow for drinking water. And still it snowed. By Saturday morning, November 25th, parts of Ohio had recorded more than 2 feet of accumulation. In Steubenville, the drifts reached the windowsills of second floors. Pittsburgh's total would exceed 30 inches, shattering every previous record. Airplanes sat frozen on runways, encased in ice like insects trapped in amber. The world seemed frozen in time. Yet, amid the white silence, the spirit of Thanksgiving endured. In one photograph taken that weekend, a group of neighbours in Wheeling stand outside a church, bundled in coats and scarves, holding lanterns as they share hot soup with stranded travellers. In another, 2 children smile beside a snowman, their cheeks red, their breath visible in the frigid air. The snow was deep, the roads impassable, and the air colder than anyone could remember. But there was warmth in every gesture. For some, the storm brought unexpected gifts. In Cleveland, one family's son, home on leave from the Navy, found himself stranded and unable to return to base. It was the first time we'd been together in 3 years, his mother later recalled. That blizzard gave us another Thanksgiving. For others, it was a lesson in humility, a reminder that, for all its progress and prosperity, post-war America was still at the mercy of nature's will. By Sunday morning, November 26th, the storm finally began to ease. The wind slowed, the snow tapered to flurries, and as the grey clouds parted, the sun returned, pale but triumphant. What it revealed was a world unrecognizable, towns buried, cars half submerged, and landscapes transformed into glittering oceans of snow. Across the Great Lakes and Appalachians, people emerged from their homes blinking in the light. Shovels rang against ice. Neighbours called out to one another, their voices echoing across the drifts. In that frozen silence, you could hear laughter again. The Great Thanksgiving Blizzard had broken records, halted travel, and claimed lives. Yet it had also reminded a nation, still new to peace, of something profound. That gratitude is not found in ease, but in endurance. As one Pennsylvania newspaper wrote in the days that followed, it was a Thanksgiving that stripped away the excess. The feast became the fire, the comfort was the company, and the blessing was simply being together. And though the snow would linger for weeks, its memory, the sight of white rooftops under a still frozen sky, would linger far longer. By Sunday morning, November 26th, the storm had spent its fury. The snow clouds finally broke, revealing a weak winter sun struggling to shine through the haze. Across the Midwest and Appalachians, a strange hush hung in the air, a calm so deep It seemed almost sacred. The wind had stopped. The sky had turned pale blue. And everywhere, the world lay still beneath a heavy quilt of white. From Michigan to West Virginia, people stepped outside to take their first full look at what the great Thanksgiving blizzard had left behind. The sight was staggering. Roads vanished beneath towering drifts. Cars protruded like shipwrecks from frozen waves, and fences, hedges, even entire barns were buried. Telephone poles leaned under coats of ice, their wires sagging in glittering arcs. Every branch, every rooftop, every porch rail gleamed in the sunlight, like the world itself had turned to glass. In Ohio, some towns were completely cut off. Plows and trucks had been immobilized for days, and the few that could move did so in slow, grinding effort. State troopers rode on horseback to deliver food and medicine to stranded families. In Pennsylvania, National Guard jeeps crawled through mountain passes, their tires wrapped in chains, headlights glowing faintly against walls of snow. And yet, amid the devastation, there was an unmistakable sense of wonder. The newspapers called it a fairyland frozen in place. Children compared it to stepping into a storybook, a world both frightening and beautiful. In the city of Pittsburgh, residents awoke to find their streets nearly unrecognizable. The drifts reached the second story of downtown buildings. Streetcars were invisible beneath the snow, their power lines drooping like ribbons. People dug out slowly, using whatever they could find. Shovels, pans, even serving spoons left over from Thanksgiving dinner. The sound of metal scraping against ice filled the morning air, echoing between buildings like a strange music of determination. One photograph from that weekend shows a line of neighbors passing snow, bucket by bucket, down a narrow alleyway. A human chain in the heart of the city. In another, a policeman helps a bundled-up grandmother step carefully across a path carved through 6 feet of snow. "We never left each other's sight," one resident recalled. Every hand was helping another. In rural towns, the task was far greater. Farmers in eastern Ohio and western Pennsylvania spent days uncovering barns and rescuing livestock. Cows had to be dug out of drifts with shovels. Chickens were found alive, miraculously sheltered beneath collapsed coops. One farmer in Jefferson County told a local reporter, "I lost a roof, but I didn't lose hope. We'll rebuild. We always do." Electricity remained out in many areas for more than a week. Families burned whatever they could to keep warm. Wood, paper, even old furniture. Some gathered at churches and schools that still had coal furnaces, turning them into makeshift shelters. Pastors organized soup lines, feeding anyone who arrived, no questions asked. In towns like Wheeling and Youngstown, church bells rang each morning not for service, but to let people know the kitchen fires were lit and help was waiting. For the first time in many people's lives, the usual pace of the world had stopped completely. No cars, no deliveries, no news, but what your neighbor told you. And in that forced stillness, people rediscovered each other. Neighbors who had barely exchanged greetings before now shared meals by candlelight. Strangers shoveled together. In one Ohio neighborhood, a man who owned a small grocery store opened his doors to everyone on the block, telling them to take what they needed and pay when you can. In Pittsburgh, children carried thermoses of soup, to police officers working around the clock to clear intersections. The cold lingered brutally. Temperatures stayed below freezing for more than a week. In the mornings, frost formed on the inside of windows, tiny white feathers spreading across the glass. Icicles as long as broom handles hung from eaves. And yet in homes across the snow-covered states, there was laughter. Families played cards by lantern light. Musicians brought out violins and harmonicas. The simple acts of keeping company, of being together in warmth and song, became the truest celebration of Thanksgiving. The clean-up, however, was monumental. It took weeks to restore full power and transportation. Snowplows formed convoys, their metal blades clanging against frozen asphalt. City crews dumped snow into rivers and empty lots, where it froze again into great heaps that lasted until Christmas. Coal trains, once halted, rumbled back to life, bringing warmth back to towns that had gone dark. The scale of the storm astonished the nation. In total, more than 150 people lost their lives, most from exposure or accidents on impassable roads. Thousands of homes were damaged, and millions were affected. In some regions, the snow measured not in inches, but in feet. Over 30 inches in Pittsburgh, 25 in eastern Ohio, 20 in West Virginia, and up to 50 in parts of the mountains. The Great Lakes froze earlier than anyone could remember, trapping ships in port. Meteorologists reviewing the data afterward called it one of the most powerful low-pressure systems ever recorded east of the Rocky Mountains. The barometric pressure dropped so dramatically that it rivaled that of a hurricane. A cyclonic blizzard, as one Weather Service report described it. In its aftermath, weather prediction methods were re-examined, leading to the modernization of storm tracking in the decades that followed. But in the homes and hearts of those who lived through it, the scientific details mattered less than the memories, the quiet heroism, the shared humanity. In Akron, a teacher remembered her students returning to class weeks later with stories of sledding from their rooftops. In Morgantown, West Virginia, a nurse recalled delivering a baby by candlelight during the height of the storm, with the help of two neighbors who had never set foot in a hospital before. Everyone became family, she said. The world outside had disappeared, but the people inside were enough. When trains finally began to move again, the first freight cars carried more than just coal and supplies. They carried letters. Messages that had been written by lamplight, now finally finding their way to loved ones across the country. Many began the same way. We're safe. The storm has passed. As December approached, the nation slowly returned to its rhythm. Children went back to school, workers to their factories, and storefronts reopened, their windows filled with Christmas decorations that looked oddly familiar. Tiny cotton snowbanks mirroring the real ones still piled outside. The air remained cold, but the spirit was warmer than it had been in years. Newspapers across the country ran editorials reflecting on the storm's meaning. It was, wrote one Ohio journalist, a Thanksgiving that stripped us of comfort and left us with clarity. We learned that gratitude isn't found in the table's fullness, but in the heart's endurance. Even weeks later, as the snow slowly melted, reminders of the storm lingered. Snowbanks turned to slush, icicles crashing from rooftops, the muddy scent of thawing earth. Children mourned the retreat of their snowy fortresses. Adults marveled that the world could change so completely, then quietly restore itself. For many, the Great Thanksgiving Blizzard of 1950 became a lifelong marker, a where were you memory that families retold for generations. Grandparents would recall the year the turkeys froze solid on the porch, the year the cars vanished, the year they spent Thanksgiving not in feasts but in fellowship. And when they told those stories, by firesides, at dinner tables, in classrooms, there was always a certain softness to their voices, a reverence not for the cold itself, but for what it revealed. That when the lights go out and the roads close, what remains is what truly matters. Warmth, kindness, and the will to endure together. The blizzard had tested the nation's strength, and found, buried beneath the snow, its heart. As December of 1950 unfolded, the snow finally began to loosen its grip. The great drifts shrank by inches each day, their edges softening beneath pale winter sunlight. Streets once silent with frost came back to life. The clatter of boots on sidewalks, the rumble of buses, the familiar hum of a nation moving again. Yet something had changed. The Great Thanksgiving Blizzard had left more than broken records and buried towns. It had left an imprint on the collective memory of a generation. For weeks afterward, newspapers and radio hosts still spoke of the Great White Weekend. Families compared stories like veterans of a shared battle, each tale a little different, but all marked by the same awe. Some remembered the cold, how it bit the skin, how breath hung in the air like smoke. Others remembered the quiet, the strange, almost holy stillness that followed the storm. But nearly everyone remembered the kindness. Letters to editors poured in from across the country. One woman from Akron wrote, "We were strangers until the snow came. By the end of that week, we were friends." Another man in Pittsburgh described the sound of church bells echoing through the frozen morning. "A sound," he said, "that reminded us we were never alone." In an era before smartphones and instant alerts, the storm had forced people to look to one another for news, for help, for warmth. And in doing so, it rekindled something ancient, the same neighborly spirit that once sustained early settlers through long, dark winters. The blizzard had become, in its own strange way, a mirror of Thanksgiving itself. When the government tallied the losses, they were sobering. More than 150 lives had been claimed. Thousands were injured. Millions of dollars in damage had been done to homes, railroads, and livestock. Yet for every statistic, there was a story of courage. A stranger who gave shelter. A community that cooked together. A family that found laughter in candlelight. In weather history, the storm remains legendary. Meteorologists now refer to it as the Great Appalachian Storm of 1950, ranking it among the most intense blizzards ever recorded in the United States. Its barometric pressure, a record-breaking 28.05 inches, rivaled that of powerful hurricanes. It was a meteorological anomaly that reshaped forecasting models for decades to come. In its wake, scientists began developing new methods for early detection of similar systems, setting the stage for the advanced weather tracking we rely on today. But while the science explains how the storm happened, the stories explain why it mattered. For families who lived through it, The Great Thanksgiving Blizzard was not merely a meteorological event. It was a moment when time itself seemed to pause. The modern rush of the post-war world, the televisions, the traffic, the endless momentum of a booming nation, was suddenly quieted. For a few frozen days, America slowed down. People looked out their windows, not at screens, but at the steady, hypnotic fall of snow. And perhaps that's why the memory of the storm endures. Because it stripped life back to its essentials. In every retelling, there's a shared sentiment that the blizzard reminded people of what truly counted. Not the size of the feast, not the gifts or the decorations, but the simple blessing of warmth and company. It became a kind of parable, the Thanksgiving when the world froze, and yet hearts stayed warm. For decades afterward, those who had lived through it would tell their grandchildren, "You've never seen a storm like 50. And the children would listen wide-eyed as their elders described snow so deep it buried fences, and skies so dark it felt like night at noon. They would laugh at the thought of frozen turkeys and snow tunnels, never realizing that behind those fond retellings lay something deeper, a quiet pride in having endured together. By Christmas, the last of the great snowbanks finally melted into slush. The holiday lights reflected off puddles where drifts had once stood, and shop windows glittered again with their usual cheer. Life, as it always does, moved forward. But in the minds of those who had lived through that Thanksgiving, something lingered, a kind of reverence for the fragility of comfort and for the strength that emerges when comfort disappears. Even now, nearly 3/4 of a century later, the Great Thanksgiving Blizzard remains a story told every November in weather almanacs, local news features, and family kitchens alike. Some remember it as a historical curiosity, the storm that rewrote records. Others remember it as a symbol of gratitude in its purest form. For you and I, sitting here so many years later, perhaps by firelight or beneath the soft hum of a lamp, it is both. A story of nature's power and of humanity's grace. Because in every generation, there comes a moment when the world demands stillness, when storms of one kind or another remind us how small we are and how precious warmth can be. The people of 1950 found gratitude not in abundance, but in resilience, not in feasting, but in fellowship. And maybe that, more than any feast or parade, is what Thanksgiving has always been about. As one old farmer wrote in his journal that winter, "The snow was high, the nights were long, but the fire burned steady, and we gave thanks just the same." The Great Thanksgiving Blizzard may have buried the nation in white, but it also uncovered something enduring. The quiet truth that even in the coldest times, gratitude can keep the heart warm. If you've enjoyed this story from Holiday History, and you'd like to help keep these cozy bedtime tales of the past alive, you can support the channel on Patreon. It helps me keep the fires burning and the stories coming. And now, as the embers fade and the snow settles softly once more, close your eyes and rest easy. Because warmth, true warmth, is never lost. It's simply passed from one generation to the next, like a candle glowing against the cold. Good night and happy Thanksgiving.